Good morning, my art history students. Welcome to our lecture about Egypt and ancient Egypt. Before I start, I just wanted to make a few announcements, things that I would tell you if I was standing in front of you in class. I've been getting emails from many of you about assignments and uploading and all of that. And I just wanted to tell you that this is all new for all of us, right? Working remotely, not being able to connect in person. Not only is it new and difficult for you, but it is for me too. And I know that I've made some mistakes in the way I have uploaded assignments and the way you're supposed to be turning them in. Particularly for my students in section 03, there was a problem with Pearson and the chapter quizzes. So please know that I will be uploading your scores, your grades for the chapter quizzes manually. I'm going to log into my Revel account and I will see exactly what you got on the quiz. I can see how much time you spent on the quiz. So don't worry if it doesn't automatically load into Canvas. I will be checking regularly and I will be uploading your scores. So I just wanted to say that before we get started. So let's talk about Egypt and ancient Egypt, and I'm going to try to keep this lecture not too long for you guys, so that you can continue to, use your book, etc. So here we go. Let's just talk about sort of the general conceptions, the general concepts that we think about when we look at Egyptian art. And what's interesting, if you guys can think, you may not know a lot about art history, but you may know exactly what Egyptian art looks like, right? And that's because the conventions, the way they show certain things, the human body, half in profile, half straight on, that we call the composite pose, those things don't change in Egyptian art. So we're going to be looking at some of these general concepts, right? What the conventions are, the human body, the whether something is idealized, which means made to look perfect, or whether it is natural. We're going to look at art and architecture as a display of power and authority. We're also going to look at the relationship between power and authority, the relationship between art and politics, something that is still relevant today, and all of these other criteria, the status of the artist, the belief system, the relationship between art and architecture, etc. So I wanted to show you guys this sort of funny little comic because people think, well, why is it that we have this, what we call the composite pose? Remember this word, it's important. Composite literally means combo, right? The combination of what? Frontal and profile. So typically the profile view is always of sort of the neck up and the waist down, and then frontal, we will see the body, the torso, the trunk of the Egyptian subject. The other thing that you guys need to think about and remember is that all art that we look at, all Egyptian art, is what we call funerary art. So if you look at these pyramids, what is the function of these buildings? Does anyone know? Think about what is the function of these buildings. Well, they're tombs. That's all they are. They're tombs. And you're going to see that the Egyptian sort of dynasty, the Egyptian culture is divided into three different periods that we'll talk about, and that the pyramids only belong to the Old Kingdom. That's because so much time has been spent building the pyramids that they realize grave robbers still get in. So you're young, you're healthy, God willing, none of us are really worried about what's going to happen. But if you think about this, how do we prepare to go out on a weeknight? How do we prepare parties and plan? But really, the Egyptians, from the minute a royal person is born, they are making plans for the afterlife. And that's what the pyramids are. They are tombs. And so when a pharaoh would be born, because to build a pyramid would take 70 or 80 years, they would start building it right away. So keep that in mind, okay? Okay, so under the pharaohs, there are actually three kingdoms and a first kingdom that we call the pre-dynastic kingdom. And we're going to be speaking a little bit about each one, sort of to give you an overview of these periods. Notice that it is only in the Old Kingdom where we have the age of pyramids, and that's important, something that I wanted you guys to think about. So in the pre-dynastic period, we notice and we learn that there's a very sophisticated civilization that begins to form around 3500 BCE, which is the same time as the ancient Near Eastern Mesopotamian state. So that's important. Remember that you learned through your reading in the book that writing is established in about 3100, right? Cuneiform writing by the ancient Near Eastern people. And in pre-dynastic times, Egypt is literally divided into Upper and Lower Egypt. And so the first work of art that we're going to talk about is this one called The Palette of King Narmer. You'll see it in the book. And it really, the subject of this work of art is the unification of Egypt. How does Egypt become unified by the king, who in fact, his name is Narmer, okay? So the first thing that you're gonna see, and let me see if I have this here for you guys, yeah, are some of the key terms that we're gonna have, right? So we have a composite view, which as you remember, I told you is this sort of combo view of the figure. So it's a convention in which you see part of the figure in profile, the face, the lower body, see the way his feet are turned sideways, and then typically the middle part of the figure is shown frontally. The other important concept that I want you guys to learn is this concept called hieratic scale. Hieratic scale means that if you are more important than someone else, you're going to be shown as bigger. You're going to be shown as larger. What am I talking about? Well, if you look at this figure of Narmer, look at how much bigger he is than one of his servants over here, right? He is much, much bigger. So, and here you can see kind of a nice image of that, right? So he's much larger than his sandal bearer, and that is what we call hieratic scale, okay? The general concepts here are that art is being used to express the power and the authority of this figure, and it's also describing this event that happened. And up here is what we called a serach, which makes the sounds nar and mer, and here's a large sort of zooming in of it. And so we know that his name is Narmer. And these are cow heads that would have been gods. The falcon that you see here is a representation of the human god Horus. And you see he's holding a rope, which is sort of trying to, everything is symbolic, right? To open up the mouth. Maybe it is sort of replicating the idea of the mummification. Here Narmer is about to slay this poor guy, his foe, and he's using his mace, which is in his hand, and this pose is actually called the smiting pose. His servant, his sandal bearer, is holding his shoes, and he is actually barefoot, which could mean that he is a god, right? When you stand on holy ground, typically you take off your shoes, and many other symbols. So this is one of the first things that we talk about in our course. This is from the pre-dynastic period, and it is called the Palette of King Narmer, dating to about 3000 BCE. So these are some of the details that on the other side, again, we have Narmer's name. We have, again, the heads of these goddesses, the Bat. Again, he's got here he is in hieratic scale, and look at all these guys over here. You might be able to see a bigger detail in your book. Let me just check for you one sec. And all of the other symbols, so look at the poor foes over there on the right, all stacked up. They're decapitated, and they are castrated. And you can see that their parts and their heads are placed between their legs, tucked between their feet, as your book says. So it's on page 51 in your book, and you can have a look and read about the Palette of King Narmer. It's a really, really important work of art. So again, remember this idea that we have hieratic scale, that we have a canon of proportions. So what does a canon of proportions mean? Say you're an Egyptian artist and Narmer, your patron, your pharaoh, says, hey, I want you to make a relief sculpture of me showing this victory that I did where I unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Well, you don't decide to show the king in any way that you want as the artist. There's a very strict system of proportions, or a canon of proportions, that is used consistently throughout Egyptian art. And that's why Egyptian art looks so similar. That's why you recognize it, even though you may not know that much about it. The concept of idealization means that a figure is depicted in the most ideal way according to the values or the conventions of this culture. And so typically we see this composite pose as the idealized version of the way to represent a human figure. What's interesting is that there is evidence that the Egyptians created these grids, and you can see the grid system here that was found on a wall that was discovered. And this is from an older version of your textbook, the 4th edition. I don't know why they took it out, because I think it's super cool to see the way they, the artist had actually drawn this onto the wall. Okay. I didn't make you a video for ancient Near Eastern art, but you hopefully learned about the victory stele of Naram Sin on your own, and you can see that here on the left. And it's very interesting, I think, to compare these two works of art. Remember, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, the ancient Near Easterns people, definitely had contact. And you can see here that Naram Sin is also shown much larger than everybody else in hieratic scale, the same thing as Narmer. Also, we see the two suns up here shining down on his military victory, and that is true of what you see on the right. There's other really interesting similarities between the two of them. So I hope you saw and read about that at the beginning of chapter 2 on page 32 in your book, The Victory Stele of Naram Sin. And the Victory Stele of Naram Sin is about, let's say, what, 700 years younger than the Palette of Narmer. So, you know, but there was definitely interaction between these two cultures, and there was trade. If you are interested, you can certainly go to Khan Academy, and you can look at the article that I put in for you. And actually, I believe it might be a video. Let's see. Maybe not. I wanted to show you, these are some of the photographs from my iPhone that I took at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So I just wanted to show them to you guys. They are so wonderful. And this again is relief sculpture. Of course, we learned about relief sculpture when we talked about prehistoric art. Relief sculpture means that it is a sculpture that is still attached to the original surface, so it's just carved. And what's interesting about this photograph is it really shows a combination of naturalism and idealism, right? So look at how natural and realistic this poor goose or duck or whatever it is, right, being held by the woman. Her hand is around its neck, its legs are stretching out, and its wings are behind it. She is standing in this composite pose, right, the combo pose. And yet there's things that are completely idealized, right? We don't know what these kind of geometric forms are. And I love to show this to you, and hopefully you'll be able to go to the museum and you'll be able to see these things. So now we're going to switch from the pre-dynastic period to talking about the Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom is typically the period that we call the age of the Great Pyramids. But we don't go from, nothing to pyramids. We kind of evolve into the world of creating the pyramids. And so we start with something called a mastaba, the mastaba tombs. And mastaba, the word mastaba means bench, typically. It was a brick or a stone structure with sloping sides that became the standard type of tomb for eminent Egyptians in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods. These tombs were grouped together in a city of the dead, and you can see that here, typically called a necropolis. And they would be at the edge of the desert on the west bank of the Nile where the sun set. What's interesting is the body would be placed in a very deep sealed chamber underground, and that's not going to be true of the big pyramids. So keep that in mind. The next step from the mastaba becomes this, the stepped pyramids. It's in your book on page 53. And if you look, you see something really incredible. This word, Imhotep. Imhotep is the actual name of the architect. We know the name of the first architect in recorded history, and his name is Imhotep. He took credit for designing and building this pyramid. So it's a really interesting, it begins with this pyramid for King Zoser, where the royal tombs become separated from other elite tombs. And it's a stepped pyramid. So one of the things that I want you guys to really understand is this, okay? Here's the ziggurat that we learned about last class, or you learned about it yourselves in the book in Ancient Near Eastern Art. And here is the pyramid. And if we were in class together, I would say to you, okay, what is the difference between these two, right? Because they look similar in a way, but they differ in both concept and purpose. Concept and purpose, and that is really, really important. This is the concept of this is kind of like, it is a combination of the town hall, the government center, the church. It's everything all in one. Remember, there's no separation of church and state in these cultures, right? You're a god and you're a king and you're all wrapped up into one person. You are the guy who's in charge. So it becomes everything, and depending on who you are, you get different levels of clearance to go up in this building, and it's, of course, the link between the earth and the heavens. But in Egypt, in the pyramids, there's only one purpose, okay? It is a tomb. And that's really important. I really want you guys to understand the difference between these things. There's no ramps. There's no way to get up here. There's no, tunnels. It's just a funerary element. And that's really, really important. And we need to just make sure you guys understand the difference between these two, right? Here we had ramps and all of that in ancient Near Eastern art, and it's absolutely not true. So what's really cool about this this area is you see this whole funerary complex, and I want you to kind of see that we can turn. Here's the Great Sphinx, right? Here's the pyramids. This is the funerary complex at Giza. Just turning this for you. Some tourists. And this is kind of what the archaeology looks like. And here you can see one of the Great Pyramids in the distance, right? So here's the evolution, right? Mastaba, stepped pyramid, and then ultimately to the Great Pyramids. Okay, so here's another kind of visual. Now what's interesting is, if you'll notice here, you'll see that there's this veneer at the top of the pyramid, and you can see it in your picture also on page 55. And what I want you guys to understand is that when the pyramids were finished, they had this incredible veneer placed over all of the stones. So this would have been covered. It wouldn't have looked stepped like that. It would have looked perfectly smooth. It would have been this limestone finish that would have kind of shone in the sun and reflected the sun. And in fact, what happened is over the years, over the thousands of years, people stole and removed a lot of this. So now the pyramids look like this. But they were not meant to be seen with all the steps like that. You would have seen them perfectly smooth in the sun and shining in the light. And here you can see kind of the three pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Menkaure, Khafre, and Khufu. You know, done in a way that Khufu is the one in the middle. And it was really quite a sight. And if you look over here on the right, you can see that that's Cairo. You can actually still see, you can see these buildings from downtown Cairo. Sometimes if you're in a hotel, you can see them. So I wanted you guys just to look at this. This is something that I found on through Microsoft. It's the Pyramids of Giza in ancient Egypt. It tells you the location of the pyramids. Here is kind of this whole necropolis, the city of the dead in floor plan, and this is the Egyptian flag. And some fun facts about the pyramids, right? What they are, the visual representation of the power and wealth, some of the ideas of the, you know, why they were built, and then all kind of the mysteries about the pyramids. Actually, how were they built? Are they kind of lining up with the things in the solar system? They're on the true cardinal points, north, south, east, west. There's a lot of mysteries still about the pyramids that we don't really know how they were built. So I urge you to kind of explore. It's a wonderful, interesting topic, and certainly we could spend a lot more time talking about the pyramids. So again, this is sort of the map that you have in your book of how people, royal funerals would happen. They would come to the temple, the Sphinx would sit here, and then the bodies would be taken into this necropolis, and then the three great pyramids. How did they do it? We're still not sure. I believe I might have uploaded a video, but there's lots of different theories about how the pyramids were built, because there certainly is, there are people who've tried to replicate them even in a smaller scale and have not been able to do that. The Sphinx is really interesting. It's actually believed to be a portrait of Chephren, one of the great, you know, his portrait of the pharaoh. It's a lion with a human head, and it was a highly visible public monument that was associated with the king. And we've seen lions before, right? We saw a lot of lions in ancient Near Eastern culture. There are no Old Kingdom texts that describe it, so we don't really know that much about it, but we know that it acted as a divine guardian against evil. And these kind of hybrid figures, these combo animal bodies with human heads, have long time been associated with kingship. And think about, even we saw a lot of lions in prehistoric art as well. It's actually carved out of one monolithic statue out of living rock. And it's really quite an accomplishment. You can see that it's 240 feet long, right? Remember I told you guys we gotta look at the boxes and we can learn a little bit more detail about them. So there you have it. And again, another one of these Microsoft sways with information about the Great Sphinx, some really good photos, where it is, you know, that it is really meant to, it's believed that it is in fact a portrait, what Khafre looked like, and that he's actually wearing the traditional headdress. This would be what you'd call an Egyptian crown, and Napoleon's troops, bad, they came and they were believed to have blown off the nose, and all kinds of other really cool things about the Sphinx, right? So here it is. We have a sculpture of Khafre, and you can see that the portrait really resembles him. So we think that this is really what he looked like. And there it is, the first colossal sculpture in history. So we learned the name of the first architect, and now we looked at the first colossal sculpture in history. Okay. I want to talk about this sculpture. It's in your book. It is Menkaure and his queen, or probably his principal wife, whose name is Kamerenebti. And we're very, very lucky that we have it here at the MFA. And so here you see one of my students. Under normal circumstances, when my students go to museums and galleries, you know I ask for a selfie. So here it is, and I asked his permission to upload this. Here he is at the museum. Yeah, so here we are. So I want to talk a little bit about this sculpture, and you can see it. It's about 4.5 feet high. Very cool to go and see something that we learn about in our book, right, that we have here in Boston. So he's believed to be the successor to Chephren, and he's standing in this very typical Egyptian pose, right? He's got one foot forward. He's probably holding what would have been symbols of his office. He's wearing the very heavy braided wig and crown. He's wearing the kilt or the skirt, the sheath, which would have been very popular in the 4th dynasty. And you can see his wife standing next to him, right? It's a really beautiful thing. Look at her little hand here, how she's sort of wrapped around him. And she's only a little bit behind him, but art historians believe that she also had, importance. Her place here next to him was quite important. So it's really interesting to see the way it's represented, the relationship between the two of them. We know that power in Egyptian culture came down through the women. So it's interesting to think about, the relationship between these two. Okay, whoops, I want to go back for a second. I believe that I assigned you this as part of your assignment for the class. We would have done this together in class where you would have compared these two sculptures. And they're described in your book on page 57, where the sculpture on the right is called the Seated Scribe. And what's interesting is we know that Old Kingdom sculptors made statues of less prominent people as well, sort of a non-royal statue. And he would have been very respected in this kind of illiterate society, right? He would be sort of writing down everything that the king does. And so he's an important person. And so what I want you to do, and I believe I gave you this as an assignment, is really compare these two, right? Think about who is idealized, who is naturalized, what are they made out of, what position are they in, what looks more timeless. All of sort of the differences between these two sculptures speak about their rank and what they are and who they are in Egyptian culture. And it gets back to one of the things that I started the course with, which is this idea that all art has intent, right? All art has intent. What does that mean? It means that all art has an idea behind it. And so the artist, whether he's making a sculpture here of a pharaoh and his queen, or a scribe, has a very specific idea of how he wants to, he or she, the artist, wants to represent these people. And so all of the choices, the material, the pose, whether the scribe has a little bit more of a softness to him, whether he looks a little bit older, all of these things are intentional choices that are being made. And so it's really important for you guys to kind of enjoy this little exercise, have a look, and compare these two sculptures because you're going to learn a lot through doing that. Okay. I just want to spend a couple of minutes on the Middle Kingdom because something really interesting happens in the Middle Kingdom. And you can see this head of Senruset. You have an image of this in your book as well. And there was sort of a lot of economic problems and hardships that were going on during the Middle Kingdom. And we see something very unusual in Egyptian art. We see that represented here. How? Well, if you look closely at this sculpture, you can see that it kind of has lines, like he has bags under his eyes. He's got a couple of lines in his forehead. He is reacting to the economic hardship as a ruler, and he wanted his people to see that, right? He wanted them to see that he was in fact that there was a realism to these facial portraits with these heavy lidded eyes and, you know, thin lips. And he's being represented here as a living, aging man. And it is one of the few instances in Egyptian art in which the ruler seems to consciously have chosen to represent his humanity rather than an idealized image of his eternal kingship. And so that's really, really important, something that I want you guys to know and understand about the Middle Kingdom. There's a choice being made in terms of representation. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the New Kingdom, the last part. It's about a 500-year period about how ancient art, Egyptian art, is refined and the changes that happen in the New Kingdom. And I want to talk a little bit about this pharaoh, who's actually a woman, Queen Hatshepsut. And she influences the world's strongest army and rules one of the richest economies. So she's a female pharaoh. She's a female queen, which really defies convention. Some people think she might have been the first great woman in history. And yet so much effort has been made to erase her name from the annals of history, which is really kind of sad. There are no more pyramids, no more great pyramids, right? Remember, I told you guys there are only pyramids in the Old Kingdom, sorry. And so here we're going to be talking about Queen Hatshepsut's temple. Oops, let me go back, sorry. Queen Hatshepsut's temple, which is here. It was one of the most beautiful structures in Egypt. You can see the way the temple kind of mimics the shape of the rocks behind it in a very kind of beautiful way. It's subdued, it's elegant, and it has a very different purpose and function, of course, than the Great Pyramids. So I'm going to play a couple of minutes of this video from Khan Academy about Queen Hatshepsut, and I want you guys to just, if you want to watch more of it after, you can certainly go to Khan Academy and just, you know, put in Hatshepsut and it'll come up, or I'll put the link up for you. So let's have a look.
This is a sculpture of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut.
We think of pharaohs, that is, ancient Egyptian kings, as male, and of course the vast majority were. There had been a long tradition in ancient Egypt of women assuming enormous authority in the position of regent, that is, as a mother or a member of the royal family who would reign until a male ruler reached an age where they could actually assume power.
Those women were very powerful, but Hatshepsut is unusual. She assumes the authority of king, of pharaoh. She created a whole mythology around her kingship that described her divine birth, the way that an oracle had predicted that she would become king. She ruled Egypt for more than 2 decades. She commissioned a remarkable number of temples, of sculptures. She was interested in the power of art to convey royal authority.
And no building speaks to the authority of the king more than the mortuary temple.
The sculpture that we're looking at was actually made for this mortuary temple. There were anywhere from 6 or 8 or 10 of these kneeling figures. There were also representations of Hatshepsut as a sphinx, which lined the center of the lower courtyard of her mortuary temple.
And that temple is an extraordinary place. It is built directly against this vast cliff face. I can't think of a more dramatic environment for architecture. Those cliffs are towering, and their organic qualities are in such contrast to the regular order and structure of the built environment.
This is hewn right from the living rock.
And that sense of permanence, that sense of stability that's expressed by that wall of living rock is a perfect expression of the very sense of stability that we think Hatshepsut and her dynasty were trying to reassert after a period of instability. This was the beginning of the new kingdom.
In ancient Egyptian history, we talk about three major periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And these periods are separated by periods we call intermediate periods.
These were periods of relative chaos, often when Egypt was divided in its rule or was ruled by external rulers.
The representations of kingship in ancient Egyptian art are almost 2 millennia old by the time we get to Hatshepsut. And so what she can do is adopt those forms to show herself as king. These forms were easily recognizable. That is symmetry, it's embeddedness in the stone. We see that there's no space between her arms and her torso or between her legs. There's a real sense of timelessness here, but there are also more specific symbols.
The headcloth that she wears is a symbol of the king. There would have originally been a cobra. We have the beard that we associate with kingship.
We're talking about a visual language here, and this visual language of kingship was male. In fact, there is no word for queen in the Egyptian language. The term is king's wife or king's mother.
Her body is represented in a relatively masculine way. Her breasts are de-emphasized, for example. She's got broad shoulders.
The inscriptions that were on many of these sculptures use a feminine form, and so the representation itself is masculine, but the identifying words, the hieroglyphs, identify her as female. About 20 years after Hatshepsut died, the pharaoh who she had been co-ruler with systematically destroyed all images of Hatshepsut.
That would not have been an easy matter. You wouldn't have simply toppled the sculpture and it would have shattered into so many pieces. This is made of granite, incredibly hard stone. It would have been very difficult to produce, and it would have been very difficult to destroy.
Well, and not only that, but Hatshepsut had commissioned hundreds of images of herself, and so it would have taken a long time to destroy these sculptures. This was an intentional act, but...
Okay, so you guys get it. I thought that that would be a really interesting video, and you can certainly continue to watch it, but I want to move on to sort of the last couple pieces that I want to talk to you about for Egyptian art, and that is in fact this other pharaoh, King Akhenaten, and his wife Nefertiti. And he looks very, very different, right? They both do. They look very different than the traditional kind of Old Kingdom style, or even the style that we would associate with Egyptian art. And this is because they change polytheistic religion in Egypt to monotheism, the belief in one God, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. The way he represents himself, that you can see here and also in this image from the book, is a change in the conventions of the way the human body is represented in Egyptian art. And it's called the Amarna period, represented by King Akhenaten. And so artwork goes through this radical shift, and you see that his face looks elongated. He looks like he kind of has a pot belly. His body is soft. He has a waist. And it's a really big difference from what we had seen before. And that's because the way that this king wants to represent himself reflects a very significant change in religion. And so this work of art that is really described in this incredible video on Khan Academy goes through all of that. So I'm just going to see if we can watch a couple of minutes of it.
So around 1350 BC, everything changed in Egyptian art.
When we think about Egyptian art, we don't think of change.
That's true. The Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and the transitional periods between art is consistent for almost 3,000 years. But there is this radical break right around 1350, and it's because the ruler, Akhenaten, changes the state religion.
He changes it from the worship of the god Amun to a new god, a sun god called Aten. So he actually changes his own name to Akhenaten, which means Aten is pleased.
Okay.
The key is he makes him and his wife the only representatives of Aten on earth. And so he upsets the entire priesthood of Egypt by making him and his wife the only ones with access to this new god Aten.
And in fact, after Akhenaten dies, Egypt will return to its traditional religion. So this period is a very brief episode in Egyptian history, but it also marks a real shift in style. And this small stone plaque that we're looking at, this sunken relief carving, which would have been placed in a private domestic environment, is a perfect example of those stylistic changes.
That it would have been an altar in someone's home where they would have seen Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti and their relationship to the god Aten. This has always been one of my favorite sculptures. It's so informal compared to most Egyptian art. We really have a sense of a couple and their relationship with one another and their relationship with their children, and love and domesticity.
So let's take a close look. On the left, you have Akhenaten himself. This is the pharaoh of Egypt, the supreme ruler. You can see that he's holding his eldest daughter, and he's actually getting ready to kiss her. He seems to be holding her very tenderly, supporting her head, holding her under the thighs. She seems to be perhaps pointing back to her mother at the same moment.
We see Nefertiti holding another daughter on her lap, pointing back to Akhenaten, and yet a third daughter, the youngest one, on her shoulder playing with her earring. And I think it's immediately apparent that there's something wrong with their anatomy. If we look at the children or we look at Nefertiti or Akhenaten, we see swollen bellies, very thin arms, and elongated skulls, forms that have made art historians wonder whether there was something medically wrong with Akhenaten.
In fact, we don't think that there was. We think that this is a purely stylistic break that was meant to distinguish this new age, this new religion from Egypt's past.
Egyptian art had been dominated by rectilinear forms. Here, Akhenaten seems to be demanding this new style, dominated by curvilinear forms.
Look at the careful attention to the drapery. There is a softness throughout that is in absolute contrast to the traditions of Egyptian art. But in some ways, there are elements of traditional Egyptian sculpture.
Right, we still see a composite view of the body, a profile view of the face, but a frontal view of the eye.
Right, or one hip is facing us, but the shoulders are squared with us, so as much of the body is exposed to us as possible while the figures are still in profile. So let's take a look at some of the iconography here. This little panel really tells us a lot. God is present, Aten is present, here rendered as the sun disk. And from that sun, which has a small cobra in it, which signifies that this is the supreme deity, the only deity. Akhenaten was a monotheist. This was in such contrast to the pantheon of gods that traditional Egyptian religion counted on. Here, Akhenaten says, no, there is only one true God. So we can see the cobra, we can see the sun disk, and then we can see rays of light that pour down. And if you look closely, you can see hands at the ends of those rays, except for the rays that terminate right at the faces of the king and queen. And there you see not only hands, but also Ankhs, the Egyptian sign of life. And so it's as if Aten is giving life to these two people and these two people alone.
Those rays of light are
So it's an awesome video, and you guys can certainly continue to watch it. That talks about King Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and really this incredible moment, right, where he's kissing his child. It's a beautiful and very unusual thing that we don't see that much, or we never really see it again in Egyptian art. So I want you guys to really understand and compare this old kingdom and this new kingdom. Pharaoh and the representation and what it means. And I just wanted to finish up by talking about, Queen Nefertiti. You can see here, this was actually some sort of a model, a sculpture that was found in a tomb. and it's believed that artists used this when they were creating sculptures of her. Very, very beautiful. The last person I want to talk about is actually King Tutankhamun. Where is he? It's not here. King Tutankhamun is probably one of the most famous pharaohs, and it's not because he was such a great guy or because he really did so much. It was, in fact, that because his tomb was discovered intact. And so this is what the tomb looked like. It was not a pyramid, of course. It was a tomb that was discovered underground. And we have some really beautiful photos at the MFA of the tomb being discovered. Imagine opening up the door to the tomb after thousands of years and seeing all of these objects that had been placed into the tomb for the king, for the pharaoh to make his journey into the next world. Gold and furniture and food and much jewelry and all the things he would need. So because this was found intact, and when the archaeologist opened the door, he said, "I see wonderful things," that is really the reason that he is one of the most well-known pharaohs, of course, also because of his sarcophagus and the inner layer of it that was made out of solid gold. So there's been quite, a variety of things that we've learned about in the discussion here of Egyptian art, the Three Kingdoms, the pre-dynastic period, the representation of the human figure. Back and talk to you guys. The representation of the human figure, how it changes, how it doesn't change, composite pose, hieratic scale, the link between power and art. You're a ruler. How do you express your power to the people who are going to be seeing images of you in a world where you don't have Facebook, you don't have Instagram, you don't have newspapers, right? The way that your kingship, your power, your authority is represented is through art. And this is something we're going to talk a lot about, specifically now, of course, but also when we talk about Greece and Rome, right? How do Roman emperors tell the empire of all their great military victories and battles and what happened? They're going to do it through art. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture on Egyptian art, and I look forward to your thoughts and seeing your assignments. The comparison between the pharaoh and the scribe, and continuing our discussion. Thank you.